Thank you, everybody. Hello and welcome. I'm Nelinia Varenas, CEO of Strategic Value Plus Solutions, and I'm delighted to be your host today for our executive webinar, Beyond Tariffs, How Shoring and TCO Build Resilient, Profitable Supply Chains. Manufacturers across the U.S. are facing a storm of challenges: tariffs, supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and shifting customer expectations. Too often, sourcing decisions are made on piece price alone, and that can be misleading, costly, and risky. Today, you're going to discover a better way. Our special guest, Harry Moser, founder of the Reshoring Initiative, will show us how to use the total cost of ownership estimator, the most effective tool available for uncovering the real costs of offshoring and for making confident, profitable sourcing decisions here in the U.S. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Harry Moser. He's the driving force behind America's reshoring movement. A former manufacturing CEO, Harry launched the initiative to help U.S. manufacturers bring jobs back by using hard data, especially the total cost of ownership estimating. Harry has spent decades proving that when you calculate total cost, which includes freight, quality, inventory, risk, tariffs, and delay, U.S. manufacturing is often the smarter, more profitable choice. He's here today to show you exactly how. So with great pleasure, I would like to introduce you to Harry Moser.
Nell, thank you very much. Good to be here with everybody. Thank the attendees for attending. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming up
Yes?
through loud and clear.
Is that yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and see if I can get it up to full size. Sure. Let's see. Can you, how's that? Full size?
We're waiting just a little. Here we go. Full screen.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes.
So first, again, thanks very much for Nell and Roy and the rest of the team for having me here and everybody else for attending. And Nell has just told you what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to do the talking. First, a little background about me. I I grew up in New Jersey, and this is an old map of New Jersey. And I'm Harry Crane Moser, and this is the Crane residence, which was founded it was first built in 1670. So back, they were the original settlers of New Jersey. And one branch of the family was Stephen Crane, who wrote The Red Badge of Courage. Some of you may have remembered reading in high school, like one of the first American novels. And this was my grandfather, Henry Crane, and he worked for the local gas utility, started when he was 17 as a plumber, and retired, as you see him here, as board of directors, secretary of the corporation at 83. So he worked 66 years for the same company, which is be a good role model for many of our youth today. And his biggest customer was Singer Sewing Machine, and this was a Singer factory back around 1900, 1920. And in its day, it was the largest factory of any kind in the world. This was 3 million square feet, 5,000 workers. So even today, it would be a gigafactory, so to speak. But back then, it was the biggest in the world. And my father, Ray Moser, ran about a third of that factory. His father was a foreman. I worked there 5 or 6 summers in high school and college. So this is really in a family thing, so to speak. And I went past 20 years ago, and nothing's made there anymore for Singer. As far as I can tell, they make nothing in the United States. Everything came in from low wage countries. The whole 5,000 people got wiped out in terms of employment. And I had the experience of the same thing happening throughout my career, selling machine tools and foundry equipment. and industry after industry, company after company I wanted to sell to, they were wiped out by lower priced foreign imports from low wage countries. And you can see that reflected in the statistics for the um, for the country. So the red line is the trade deficit as a percentage of GDP, and that went from being we were positive through the end of about 1979, and then it's been consistently negative since then. And last year was $1.2 trillion. So we imported 1.2 trillion more than we exported. And at the same time, or as a result, our manufacturing employment as a percentage of total US employment dropped from about 27% to about 8 or 9%. And so, very tough impact on my hometown, but also on many of your towns around the country. And much of this was were self-inflicted wounds. We that nationally, geopolitically, we sacrificed manufacturing to advance middle-class democracies. The Marshall Plan, great thing in its time, let China into WTO and most favored nation status. We had very low duty rates. We paid for wars, for better or for worse, thinking we were protecting the world, protected the world shipping, and we've had the reserve currency, which is an exorbitant privilege for finance, for banks, but it's a curse for manufacturing because it drives up the value of the dollar, making us not competitive. And so, it enabled that high US dollar, a low savings rate, deficit spending, trade deficit. All these negative things have come from really our own action. So it is, partially it's certainly that China cheated and all that kind of thing. But as much as anything, it's our own fault that these things happen to us. One of the results of all that is that because of the roughly trillion a year trade deficit for so many years, uh, our dollars went offshore, and now foreigners own about 20 trillion more of US assets than Americans own abroad. So in effect, they're getting a, a return on that $20 trillion. So the interest on it, the dividends on it, whatever, think of that as $1 trillion a year going offshore to pay them for holding the money that they got by selling us goods in excess of what we bought from them. That's a significant problem for us going forward. This all came about because the US price level is so high. Our manufacturing cost is consistently higher than in almost every other country. And I have the best data on China. And in this case, I took 190 cases where people who used our TCO estimator, so the thing that Nell was talking about and that I'm going to get into, people who used that and had put in the China price, like the FOB price or the X-Works price, and the US price, or it could have been manufacturing cost if it was a company that owned both of the factories. And so the horizontal axis is China price as a percentage of US price. At 100%, they're equal. To the left, China is cheaper. To the right, US is cheaper. So the US is almost never cheaper. And the mode for this, the midpoint, the mean, is somewhere down here around 65%. So just as a elevator speech kind of a number, China price is about 65% of the US price, manufacturing cost price, whatever you want to call it. And therefore, if you invert that, the US price is about 60% higher than the Chinese price. And that's a huge amount. That with China and somewhat smaller differences for Mexico, South Korea, India, etc., it has been the motivating factor that drove so much of that work to go offshore that resulted in the huge trade deficit that we have. And many of the economists and the pundits will say this is inevitable. We're a high wage country, just relax and enjoy it, do trade stocks and bonds, sell things to each other, do lawyer, doctor kind of thing, write software, and let those other countries do all that dirty stuff. And that inevitably manufacturing employment should decline in the United States. And they think of that as an iron law, and we shouldn't even fight over it. We should just accept it. And yet, if you look at the other countries around the world and what percentage of their workforce is manufacturing, darker numbers are higher, like the darkest is over 20%, the lightest is 5% or less. And you can see the US is much lighter than most of Europe, lighter than Japan, lighter than South Korea. So lighter than many of the countries that we think of as essentially our peers, or even less industrious and industrial than we are in Europe. And so it turns out that the average for those other developed countries turns out to be about 13 or 14% of their employment being manufacturing, whereas ours is only 8 or 9%. And the difference between those two is about 50%. So like 13 or 14 divided by 9, 1.5. And that difference, 50%, is roughly what we need to do to balance the goods trade deficit, because they collectively have balanced their goods trade. And so our mission is to eliminate that trade deficit. The result will be manufacturing increasing by about 40%, improved income equality, budget deficits. We have a $2 trillion budget deficit. That'll significantly be reduced, less emissions. The pundits talk about us being an innovation economy instead of a manufacturing economy, but it turns out that if you don't manufacture, and especially manufacture near your engineering, then the innovation of the engineering is not as effective. It's better if the two of them can work together on the topic. By bringing it back, we'll have more automation and competitiveness that will all be strengthened. Our defense industry, which is extremely weak, will become sufficient. We'll have modern facilities, and any of you who sell capital equipment like machine tools and such, like I used to, annual capital investment especially in equipment, would be up about 50% from what's been typical for the last 5 or 10 years. So just to be a hugely different economy than what we have today. To try and move us in this direction, I've communicated with the White House. I have some decent contacts there. And concerning the workforce, we suggest more skilled, most people call them trades, I call them professionals, and engineers. We replace a college for everyone with a good career for everyone. So we don't have so many kids, it's just sort of passing time for 4 years. And instead, we get them working and learning something and being productive. And in terms of industrial policy, my first choice is currency, to get the dollar down by 10 or 15%, because that's the root cause of the problem that we have. Alternatively, a value-added tax or tariffs, as Trump has been implementing, but in about that order of priority. Taxes, I was very pleased that the Big Beautiful Bill passed immediate expensing, which means you can write off in the year of investment the complete value of the equipment and other capital investments you're putting in. And that I put a check mark next to that because that's legal now. But one of the things I proposed that President Trump do is ask all companies to buy and source based on total cost of ownership, TCO. And if they did that, if we could get all of them, if all of you and all of your contacts to do that, then the amount of let's say $200 billion, $300 billion worth of manufacturing would come back just based on companies doing the math correctly, as I will show you. My purpose today is to show you that reshoring has been strong, that it's happening, and to help companies decide where to produce and source, how to compete with imports. So both a purchasing decision tool and a selling tool, how to encourage customers to produce and source more here and buy from you, and doing all that by recognizing all the costs and risks using total cost. And Nell mentioned tariffs, and everybody worries. There's certainly been a lot of uncertainty about that because it's very hard to figure out what's going to happen. But by reshoring, one mitigates those future tariff risks and also the geopolitical risks, which are substantial today. So concerning tariffs, they're very high profile pain today. So for anybody who's an importer who imports a significant amount of product or components, tariffs are a significant problem. So I'm not here to minimize that, but they often can be eliminated by reshoring. So if you bring the work back, or when you bring the work back, then you're no longer subject to the tariffs, assuming you're getting your components and materials and such here. And TCO, total cost of ownership, is a tool to decide what can be economically reshored, and specifically um, without considering tariffs. So in the condition of, say, a year ago, 15% or more of what's now being imported would come back if all companies would do the math correctly. And with the tariffs, let's say a 15% tariff, then roughly 30% would come back. So that's 30% is of roughly $2 trillion worth of imports. That's $600 billion worth of manufacturing. That's 3 million manufacturing jobs. So we're talking millions of manufacturing jobs going back in your factories, in your county or state, wherever you work, but also for the nation. So fortunately, the balance is being reshored. We talk about reshoring, onshoring. I'm doing a presentation next week where they call it here-shoring, HERE shoring. But whatever you want to call it, it's U.S. companies bringing back the manufacture of products that will be sold or assembled here. An equally important trend is FDI, foreign direct investment. So it's the same logic. So in reshoring, GM maybe decides to once again make an engine or a hub or something here. And under FDI, Toyota decides to produce more here and import less from Japan or Mexico or somewhere else. A lot of talk about localization, which is producing near the consumer, and about nearshoring, which would be bringing work back to Mexico or Canada from far away. So, for example, to something that you've been getting from China or India or something like that to produce in Mexico or Canada. And my first choice is to obviously have it done in the United States, but I'd much rather have it in Mexico or Canada than in those foreign long distance places because it's much closer and they're more friendly to us than, say, China is at the moment. And so and specifically about for product that's exported from Mexico to the US, about 40% is US content, and therefore you get sort of 40% of a loaf when you get it back from China, because from China only 5% is US content product coming in. So to show you the trend in this over the years, we track reshoring and FDI, which I described to you, foreign headquartered companies. And in 2010, when we started, about 11,000 jobs were identified coming back, identified, typically with a year or 2 years until the plant's built, the people are hired, et cetera, et cetera. And the trend has progressed, like at most trends, up and down, but generally consistently upward, such that last year about 244,000 were announced, and this year we're currently projecting 220, 230,000, so about the same as last year. But behind those numbers for this year, we've identified about 40 companies from whom this is just a small sample who have said, we're going to do it. The kind of people that get up with President Trump and say, we're going to invest $1 billion or 10 billion or 650 billion, like in the case of Apple. This is just a small list of those companies, but we've got about 40 of them. And if they all do what they say they're going to do, then the numbers I showed you for this year, instead of being 230,000 jobs, are going to be 350,000 or even higher. But the key to it for most of these companies, either explicitly or implicitly in what they announced, is that they're going to act, they're going to start digging the hole, they're going to start building the foundations and hiring people when the tariffs firm up. So tariffs are a scary thing to some people, but to these people, to these companies, it's the incentive that makes reshoring or FDI economically feasible. And so I prefer currency to tariffs, but if you're going to do tariffs, it's critical that the country get them firmed up at I'd say a reasonable level, sort of 15%, and then that the companies can look at that and say, I'm confident that's real. I'm confident it'll be in place for 5 or 10 years at least, so I can build a factory, hire people, make money on my investment instead of getting halfway through with that and then it all goes away and we're no longer competitive in those industries. Mm-hmm. So to understand this a little better in terms of the background, most of this got started in 21 and 22 with COVID, and we got really started then because the country and companies understood our dependencies for PPE, for pharmaceuticals, for rare earth minerals, for all kinds of stuff. We said, darn, we're not self-sufficient. We're very dependent on others, especially adversaries. And then we've had a series of disruptions from the Thai flood, the Chinese COVID, our own LA dock strike, Suez Canal, Israel, Hamas, Ukraine. And people say, "Wow, that messes up my supply chain some." Those are really difficult, but hanging over all of it is the concern about geopolitical risk, especially around Taiwan. So if or when China invades Taiwan, it's going to be a major situation. Nothing will come out of either of those countries in terms of shipments of components, and any company that thinks they're going to get those is fooling themselves. And then when nothing comes out of those countries for an extended period, and you or your company are looking for where to find replacement sources for those components, well, 100,000 other companies are going to be looking for the same resources, the same companies to make the same things for you, and those companies are going to be swamped, and they're going to say, "Sorry, I'm going to take care of my existing customers." So considering these factors, it's important for companies to structure their supply chains more resiliently. So this is I think, a very interesting chart that Resolink put out. They're a very high-end consumer supply chain consultant. And if you look at the visual up there on the upper left, they say we've gone from the left side of that, which is companies worrying about saving pennies on the components they buy. So spend was all they had to worry about. And it seemed to work because for year after year, the products came through from China, from everywhere else. It was mostly pretty consistent. But they're going from that condition, worrying about saving the pennies, to on the right side, worrying that they head the components or receive the components so they can get their revenue, get their margin, and keep their customers. And so this is a major change in the thought processes and the priorities for companies. They still, concerned about money. They don't want to throw it away, but it's more important to have the product at a somewhat higher price than not to have it at a lower price. So we came out about a year ago with a geopolitical risk map that shows the probability of decoupling, the probability of a U.S. company being cut off from a foreign country for an extended period of time due to something like war. And we have the probability for each of the countries. I've got a table on our website that says what the numbers are, because you can't quite read them here. And the idea is for the company to say, well, if I got cut off, how long would it really take me to replace that supply? And therefore, how much revenue would I lose? How much margin would I lose? Times a probability gives you an expected value of loss. And therefore, how much more should I be willing to pay today to either start making those components or products here, or find somebody else in the US or Canada or Mexico, say, to make them for me? And yet companies look at this, and I talk to them about it, and they say, but the US is still too expensive. And we say, not so much if you look at total cost of ownership instead of just looking at price. And so it turns out the majority of companies look at rudimentary measures like looking just at wages or purchase price variance, or what's the X works price in each of the two locations, or landed cost, a little better, but includes freight and duty. And to show you the difference in these impacts, this chart is the blue line is that same data on China. So the 190 cases of China versus the US. And the horizontal axis is still China as a percentage of US. So the blue line is price, the red line is total cost of ownership. So the exact same case is done by the exact same users of the software. And then the yellow line is the exact same cases, but with a 15% tariff added in, such as the tariffs about where we're probably going to wind up with most of the countries except China. And the key thing to look down at is down here in the lower right-hand corner. So based on price, the US wins about 8% of the time. You remember there's very few cases to the right of the $100% column. Based on total cost, 32% of the time. And based, if there's a tariff, then 46% of the time. So by getting companies to look at total cost instead of just price or maybe landed cost, probabilities go from 8% or a little higher with landed cost to 32% with total cost and 46% if there's a 15% tariff, which is going to be the case with almost all the countries, except for maybe Mexico and Canada if the product fits the criteria for 0% tariffs. So some of the overlooked factors that are especially important in TCO that companies often ignore. So delivery. There's an advantage to getting quicker delivery on your components because it gives you quicker delivery on your end product when you're getting that out to your customers. And that has substantial value. It's something that's been easy to overlook when everything works smoothly, but when it might not work smoothly, very critical. Geopolitical risk, I told you about that. The benefit of having manufacturing near engineering so they can cooperate well together. IP risk, intellectual property risk. China especially is famous for ripping off companies. I get calls from companies periodically telling me how they got ripped off on their tooling, their intellectual property. They created a new competitor by sourcing over there. And certainly not always can happen, but happens much more than here. The risk of emergency air freight, multiples by 10 times or something times surface rate. And you hope it's never going to happen, but to every company, it inevitably happens periodically. Inventory carrying cost. We see in general that when a company cuts back, when it changes from importing from, say, Asia to local sourcing here, that the inventory of the things that they've bought are reduced by 60-70%, something like that. So substantial, and for a big company, we're talking hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, which can pay for some of the difference in the cost. So let me skip through these and then come back to this at the end. I'm going to show you about the TCO estimator, but I think maybe it's easier if I just keep going through the slides at first and then come back. So here's some examples of this that you can relate to. So this is I've been telling you our data, but this is from KPMG, which is a really big consulting company, much bigger than the Reshoring Initiative, and they did a study for a company, and they agreed with the company that the company would offshore production to a low-wage country, and they figured they were going to save $50 million, 50 million, based on lower labor cost. And it sounds like a great project. Everybody's going to be happy. But when they got done and they went back and audited it, they found out that their freight costs rose by 20 million. They had service level penalties. In other words, they were late on delivery to their customer and got penalties. That was 12 million. And they had additional inventory carrying costs, which I just referred to, of 27 million. And therefore, their total cost went up by 9 million instead of coming down by 50 million. And this is very consistent with the kind of results that I was just showing you. Now, there are certainly some cases, if you think of those charts that I showed you, there's some of the cases way off to the left end where say the Chinese cost is 30% of the US cost. And in that case, that would have swamped, these other numbers that I'm showing here. So the point I'd like to make is that many times or often or 20-30% of the time, what you or your company or your potential customer are importing, the company would be smarter, more profitable, more resilient if they were short. So I'm not saying everything can come back, but a significant percentage, 15, 20, 30% typically can be brought back and without having to raise prices to your customers and without having to impact your profitability. This is another case. This is my favorite case. This is Mori Corp, and they produce they populate circuit boards, kind of thing you see there. And most, and I was just talking to somebody in the industry yesterday, and I think we concluded that 70 or 80% of the printed circuit boards that are consumed in the U.S. are imported, and maybe 20% or something, 30% are made here. So we're very dependent on foreign, and so Maury, I had two interactions with them. First, they had an aluminum die-cast housing for their circuit boards, and that housing and the board in it was typically used in Caterpillar, somebody like that, outside in the rain and so on. And I think it must have leaked or something, and the customer was furious and insisted they find a domestic source for the aluminum die castings. They did that, and the quality was fixed, customer was happy, but they audited the results and they said that their inventory was cut by 94%, because instead of receiving a container of it once a quarter, they're receiving a box once a day or once a week, and therefore they were down to almost no inventory, but they had a local supplier that if they needed inventory, they could get it very quickly. So really effective just-in-time delivery. The even bigger event, they came to me about 5 years ago and they said, Harry, we've got a problem. And I said, what's the problem? We're going to lose a big order. And I said, oh, what can we do? So we did the TCO calculation together and showed the customer, the VP sales showed the customer that even though Maury's price was higher than the Chinese offering, Maury's total cost to the customer was lower. And I have a letter from them on their letterhead saying that was key to winning a $60 million order. So the point I want to make here is that the TCO is a way for a company to buy smarter, and hopefully, you hope that your customer will do that. But if they're not doing that, if they're only looking at the price or maybe just the landed cost, then by convincing them to look at all the relevant costs and risks, in other words, at the total cost, can help that company be more successful, and obviously you to get the order from that company, which is what my objective is here. So another example of this, GE Appliances, which notably was one of the two winners of the National Metalworking Reshoring Awards last week, which I gave out at FabTech in McCormick Place. So their CEO, Kevin Nolan, has repeatedly made this comment, which is entirely consistent with what they've done, because they've invested until like a month ago, they had invested $3 billion in the U.S. primarily for reshoring, and then about a month ago, they announced another $3.5 billion worth of investments, and so $6.5 billion, much of it, I can't get an exact percentage, but more than half of it for reshoring. And I've got a list of like 5 or 6 different kinds of appliances that they had been making in Mexico, or they had been buying from China and bringing into the United States. And instead, they're going to make them in Louisville and 4 or 5 other factories around the United States. But the logic, the philosophy, the strategy that has guided this is what I've said here, what he said, what Kevin said here, and that the reality, if you look at the reality, if you look at the real economics, that people are going to realize that the savings they thought they were getting, looking just at the price or just at the wages, really aren't real. And when you do the math correctly, you'll find out that it's better and cheaper to make them here. So for me, I'm just talking about it, but Kevin's putting billions of dollars into implementing it and making sure that it really happens. And as a result, at least according to the numbers they've shown me, they've grown to be the biggest appliance maker in the country, and done dramatically well by reshoring. That's been a very successful project for them. Here's another case. This is from 10, 12 years ago. One of the first groups I got in touch with, Hubbard & Forge. They make high-end lighting products like you see here. obviously the thing on the top, I don't think the vase or art on the bottom, but very high end, rather expensive, and they reshored happened to get aluminum die castings from China to Vermont, which is where they're located, and they used total cost of ownership analysis to come to that conclusion, and uh, with and some of the benefits were in inventory, lower inventory, shorter lead times, with much less freight cost, and the ease of, like I said, manufacturing and engineering working together to redesign and flexibility. And they pointed out the importance of making the right decision initially, because if you coming out with a new product and you're going to have tooling and you make it here, well, that makes sense. But once you've got it over there and the tooling is there, and your supplier over there thinks he or she owns the tooling, and you want to try and get the tooling back, it's awfully hard to get it back because they think they own it and they're not going to give it to you. And if anything, they're likely to start competing with you using your tooling to make an identical product. So this is some oversight or overview of their what they did. So they connected with us. They got the TCO calculator. They use it to identify all the elements that are relevant. But then they use that to come up with a customized version. So here's their work. They picked, and I like you to use our full version, but I'm showing you how they made it easier on themselves. They picked mostly fixed input variables that were most important to them, and picked 8 user inputs instead of, say, the 29 that are in the full system, because the other 21 they believe were consistent across the board and didn't have to be thought of each time. And they found it again best when using it for new product development. So here's their version of our TCO calculation. So you can call it like TCO Junior or something like that. And they decided that the 9 factors that are down here were the most important for their calculations, and that these were consistent for their calculations, and they had numbers set up for those consistently, and then it made it much easier for them to, instead of doing the whole 29 and working the thing out. Okay, I'd forgotten all those things were there. So the key things that were most important, the things that varied, were quantities, lead times, landed cost, annual forecast quantity, product life, because that's the life over which you're going to have to amortize your investment. And so they're making decisions now, component by component basis. They've seen components that have been sourced overseas now sourced domestically, so they did bring some things back. They they found that down to a unit price difference of 50%. So down to something like 50 or 60%. So roughly the average for the Chinese product that I was showing you. So down to roughly that point, they were good candidates for keeping domestically. If you went below that, if you went to where the foreign cost was 40% or 30%, then that no longer made sense. The size and weight made a big difference, because the freight costs, and tooling is important, because unfortunately tooling in the U.S. is relatively expensive, because it's rather labor intense, as opposed to being material or say machine tool intense or something like that. Okay. They said it's not just a supply chain decision. You need engineering and product development teams working together. Make the right decision when the component is first sourced, so you don't have to pull it back. Okay, that's a very nice group, and great company. If you need some high-end lighting, I'd recommend them. This isn't quite TCO, but it's a great story, and I wanted to put it in here. This is Nedco, New England Die Company, and that's Joe Alameda, who founded it. I used to sell him machine tools, and I was looking around for a good case to write an article about, and he had two or three very high end tradesmen or professionals, who could make the products that I'm showing there on the right. They're carbide, a very specialized tool, great surface finish, you can see, and extreme accuracy. And they were doing it essentially manually. I mean, not with a file, but on a machine where you turn in dials and things like that. And he went out and bought a grinding machine, automated grinding machine, happens to be a Studer, and it turned out that his two or three employees were all retiring at about the same time, and he in effect replaced him with this machine. He actually does it himself, and he cut the labor hours per piece by 85% from what he was before. His scrap rate went from something, I didn't get the exact number, but down to zero. And now 70% of the work in his shop is done on this automated machine. And so automation isn't the answer for everything. It's useful for every application, but it's not a complete answer for everything. You can't, and that's because the Chinese especially are investing 2 or 3 times as much per year as we are in automation, and therefore you have to, if we upped our game substantially in terms of automation, we'd still just be running parallel with them. So we need automation, plus we need to something like currency or tariffs to overcome the residual difference. But I think it's just a very uplifting story that he did so well. Great guy. We're also working on a revision for the TCO estimator, and specifically it would quantify ESG. So many of you know environmental, social, and governance. The environmental is fairly easy to quantify. Social a little bit harder, and governance I haven't been able to quantify it. But a lot of companies have claimed that they're pursuing ESG improvement, and especially environmental. And it turns out that something like 75% of the emissions of companies, 75% is in the supply chain. And if the supply chain is overseas, especially China, then there's a lot of emissions on the shipping, but even more so, there's an emissions difference in the electricity being produced over there. For example, China is 50 or 60% coal, and US is 10 or 15% coal in making electricity. And therefore, the electricity used to make the product, if the product is fairly electricity intense, creates a lot more pollution in China than it would here. Therefore, you bring it back, and we've got cleaner results. Geopolitical risk, tariffs is going to quantify all those to try and bring the number down to one number that you can look at. It also simplifies. So in terms of our existing TCO estimator, there's some things that are not as easy as I'd like them to be. And the new revision, when I get it finished, will overcome some of those considerations. We did a survey in 2025. I did it with Reshoring, did it along with Regions Recruiting, Kathy Nunnally. If anybody needs a good search for him, he's incredibly good. And here are some of the things we found. But the reasons companies gave to reshore: having manufacturing near engineering, freight and duty, geopolitical risk, and the other things that you can see up there. We asked, this is one of the key questions that I designed the survey around: how much of your product now sourced offshore would you consider reshoring if? And we tested sort of Trumpian policies, and you can see the percentage that would come back for a lower dollar, for less regulations, lower corporate tax rates, tariffs, 15% tariffs. But better, more impactful than any of those was if the U.S. had the skills, higher skills, and was in sufficient quantity. That outplayed all those other considerations. And for decades, I've been working on the U.S. workforce, and I think it's an absolutely essential necessity. If you're going to reshore, you have to make sure you've got the workforce available to do the job. We asked the companies how they compare offshore versus domestic options. And you can see 30% of them use total cost of ownership, some version, I'm sure not all our version, and other percentages, 18% still look just at price, 35% landed cost, which is sort of halfway in between, And so significant percentages are not optimizing. They're using only a portion of the information they should use to make the decision. And for them, that's an opportunity to make smarter decisions about their buying. And for you, if you're selling to them, it's an opportunity to convince them to buy from you instead of importing. Uh, we believe that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan is a significant possibility. You know, many people say that they're going to do it by 2027, and so we asked them, how concerned are you about the risk of companies? How concerned are you about the risk of such an event? 56% said they're concerned. Not a lot, but it's some. But only 35% have identified any products to reshore now as insurance. And you know, I'd like to have seen 100% concerned and 80% that have done something. So to the extent that they're not doing anything, they have an existential risk if and when something happens. I've always thought delivery was an underappreciated asset, so to speak, or variable. And so we asked how much more they'd pay for a 1 week sort of local delivery as opposed to a 6 week Asian surface kind of delivery. And you can see that 50-60% of them would pay anywhere from 5 to 20% more for the product. Why? Because of less inventory, easier communication, quicker response, all these kinds of things. So to the extent that you can improve your delivery times, and you have at least another sales point to gather the work from the foreign competitors. So we surveyed 220 OEMs, so big companies, branded product kind of companies, and then we also had 280 contract manufacturers, and we asked them, have you reshored? And a substantial portion of them, yes, 29% have reshored. Some just took out orders. Some are in the process of doing it. Some are currently quoting. So only 30% said they had not. And maybe 13% they said they're not sure because they don't know where the supplier used to get the product. So conclusion, the pretty good motion on the part of the contract manufacturers. We asked how often they use, let's say, I'll start again. Only 31% of them said they always use TCO as a sales tool when competing with imports. So to the extent that they're not doing that, then they're missing an opportunity because the survey also showed that the imports typically had a 25 or 26% lower price, and if you're not finding some way to overcome that price, well, you're probably going to lose the order. So that was the results from the survey. I mentioned skilled workforce being very important. So we've done a series of articles for AMT, which puts on IMTS, the 100,000 person machine tool show at McCormick every even year. And so we found industry leaders who started as apprentices and are now leaders in the industry, making more than the average for PhDs, et cetera. So actually, we've got 4 or 5 articles out now on that. And if you know anybody who meets that criterion, I'd love to hear from them and include you or them in the article series. We need more examples. Here's an example. This fellow's Crispin was president of Index Corporation's North American subsidiary, and a picture of him now and a picture of him when in the early years when he was an apprentice. And so we tried to make the articles such that a high school student could relate to them and say, yeah, I that looks about sort of like I do now, and I'd like to be looking like that when I'm 65 and doing well and making a good buck, and might be enough to convince them to join your apprenticeship program. What we're talking about here is U.S. industrial policy, and for decades or probably a century, the U.S. has sort of stayed away from industrial policies. Libertarian philosophy thought we shouldn't do it, let the market decide. And this is a interesting comment from this Michael Pettis, who's an international expert, and he says we're living under industrial policy no matter what we do, because all the other countries have policies in terms of workforce, in terms of currency, in terms of taxes, in terms of all kinds of things, trade, duty. And if we don't have an industrial policy, then we're living under their industrial policy. But since that doesn't make sense and hasn't turned out to work very well for us, given the trade, let's have our own industrial policy and at least take care of things better. This may be a controversial point, but I think is worth noting. I'm an engineer, and this related to me. This very popular current novel or book put out by Dan Wang called Breakneck uh, looked at the fact that China has done so well compared to us in manufacturing growth, investment, productivity gains, like 6% versus zero, innovation, probably innovation. And he says the key difference is that at least back in 2002 in China, all 9 members of the Politburo were engineers, whereas the US is run by lawyers. So I looked up and you can see the statistics down here about how many engineers versus how many lawyers in the House and the Senate. And so any of you who are engineers out there, it'd be good if you became a congressman or a senator and or supported them, because I think a more quantitative, a more future oriented, less legalistic approach might be good for the country to make reshoring more successful. In terms of the impact of tariffs, I picked up a recent news piece that this Elwood Group makes forged products, and their sales have jumped dramatically, driven in part by the tariffs. Just not to say that everybody's doing that, but at least some are. So some recommendations for you. Um, develop the skilled workforce. I think it's absolutely essential. Buy, sell, and justify buy smarter, sell smarter, and justify investments like new equipment or new facilities smarter by considering TCO, including ESG, geopolitical risk, just in time, tariff mitigations, getting rid of tariffs. Work closely with customers engineering because they like that, and you'll be better off if you do that. Promote reshoring on your websites. Most companies don't do it, and I think they should. Improve delivery. Companies are willing to pay for more delivery. If you are in metalworking and you reshore, apply for the National Metalworking Reshoring Award. Okay, some questions to ask your company and your customers. If things, if product coming out of China and Taiwan stopped coming, how severe would the impact be? Are you reshoring now as insurance? If not, why not? Are you using TCO? So asking your company and your customers those questions, they'll be better off. This is that National Metalworking Reshoring Award I mentioned. The fellow on the left is Bill Jones, who's the VP Supply Chain for GE Appliances, one of the winners, and the one on the right is Drew Greenblatt, who owns Marlin Steel Wire Products, which started making bagel baskets, but now makes all kinds of baskets like for dunking tools and components in to clean them and so on. So very successful. They've done a great job with engineering and productivity, beating out foreign products that sell for less than his cost of steel. So just been very successful. So this was at FabTech last week on Thursday, and I encourage you to apply if you've reshored something metallic to apply for the 2026 award, which will be at IMTS, the real big machine tool show in Chicago. So we're a nonprofit with 32 sponsors, and we bless all these groups that support us and make it possible for us to do what we do. And this shows how to reach us. Any of you who get this file can do that. I had intended to show you the TCO estimator, but I'm running out of time to do that. But if you go to our website, which you can see here as reshorenow.org, and you'll find a blue bar at the top, and there's one of the items on it is the TCO estimator, and you click on that, and then you have to create an account by putting in your email address and a password, and then you sign up, and then you sign in, and you go to the TCO estimator, and it asks you a bunch of questions like, what industry are you in? What do you want to call the file? That kind of very email address, but we don't ask for your company name. We don't ask for your part number of the part because you might not want to give up proprietary information. And then you answer a series of questions like, how many of these things do you buy a year? Where you're thinking of the U.S. and what other country? What's the price from each of those places? What's the what quantity are you going to buy a year? How often are they going to ship? Might be different, maybe less frequent from far away, more frequent from local. Um, how likely is it to be air freighted? Et cetera. So a series of questions like that can be added up to create the total cost, and also for example, to estimate how much your inventory will be, because the average inventory level will determine the inventory carrying cost. So ask a series of questions like that. You fill it out, and that's on the input page. And then there's a results page, which is populated by calculations based on your inputs on the input page. And on the inputs page, we provide explanations so you know what we're looking for in terms of information. And on the results page or outputs page, there's an equation for each cell. So just like on Excel, you click on something and it'll say this number is calculated by A1 times B4 times the square root of something or other. Huh? So this in this column that describes the calculation, it says how the numbers on the results page are calculated, and it isn't like the numbers like in Wizard of Oz just sort of appearing out of nowhere with from somebody behind a curtain. Instead, you can say here's the equation. Yeah, I agree with the equation, and it's based on these two or three factors from the inputs page. You go back and say, yeah, you can do the calculations. Say, yeah, the number the system comes up with is correct. It's not like there's any funny games going on. So, and then at the end of that, it estimates, it breaks the costs down. So it comes to a total cost down here, and it breaks the costs down between hard costs like cash, price and freight and things that are where you have to spend money today, and then sort of future costs like risks of geopolitical risk or risk of stocking out or that kind of thing, and then qualitative sort of subjective things like the societal impacts and things like that that are harder to quantify. And your company may say, I don't care about any of those. So by breaking these numbers out into these different categories, you can pick and choose amongst them, and consider the ones that your company ascribes to, and ignore the ones your company doesn't subscribe to. So I think if you go to the website, again, reshoringnow.org, go to TCO Estimator, and then I think I believe you'll find it very useful. If you need help, you can email me. You got my email address. And I'd love to hear of your success with it, or if you have problems with it, let me know. And as we revise the new version, we'll take your concerns under consideration. So now I think we've got maybe a couple of minutes left, just about on
Yeah,
time. Huh?
Harry, I
Yeah.
can figure out the square root of 9 is 3, but I'm glad that your tool figures out everything else. Spoken like a true engineer, with lots of thought. You put lots of thought into this presentation, very rich with information, bringing us forward to today, from your history, your family history, and connecting us in that way with your presentation. Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, Nell.
We have run out of time, but thank you so much for giving out your email information so if people have questions and they can reach out to you. And also, you can reach out to us. And let's continue this conversation. And just really, really love this presentation. And will we have access to this presentation, Harry?
Well, you've got the PDF.
Yes, I know, but would you mind if I shared it?
No, I'd be delighted if you shared it. And
Okay.
if anybody really I would have sent you a PowerPoint, except it was 48 megabytes or something. And
Yeah.
so if anybody wants to use a couple of slides and wants to email me and say, Harry, I saw it, I'd like slide 37 and 52 or something, then I'll send you the deck or the slides or
Oh,
whatever you want.
Oh, thank you, Harry. All right. So what's going to happen after this is I'm going to share the slide with everybody who's registered and also reach out to them for follow-up. And again, Harry, really enjoyed this meeting today, this presentation today, and knowing you too as well. Thank you from the bottoms of our hearts. And yeah, I guess if do you have any parting words that you'd like to say?
No, again, if I'd like to hear of your reshoring successes, I'd like to help you achieve more successes in the future. And so, but I can only do that if you contact me and ask for help. And but Nell's also here. Nell and Roy are here to help you also. So call on any of us that you'd like to.
Very good, very good. Okay, and with that, we will close the show for today. Thank you all for joining and for staying for the end. Harry's a great man to know. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.